spoke to Martin Lawrence this morning while he was doing interviews for his new DVD, Doing Time.
What can I say about him? We were friends way before the Martin show, and we got to bring that friendship.
We all remember the laughter, the calm voice in the chaos, the friend who never raised his voice, but somehow always stole the scene. To millions, he was the smooth-talking best friend, the heart of Martin, the man whose quiet confidence balanced the madness, whose presence felt steady, familiar, safe. But behind the jokes, behind the catchphrases, there was a life far more complicated than the sitcom ever showed. Thomas Mikl Ford appeared to have it all figured out. A legendary role, a respected name, a future that seemed secure. Even in his final days, everything looked hopeful. A routine surgery, positive updates, smiles shared with fans who believed a comeback was right around the corner. Then, without warning, everything stopped. What happened in the final hours of his life raised questions that still linger. Questions about timing, about coincidence, about how someone can appear to be healing, only to vanish days later. Beyond the public smile was a private world few truly knew. A world shaped by ambition, frustration, love, conflict, and a constant struggle to live up to an image frozen in time. This is not just the story of a sitcom icon. It's the story of the man behind the laughter, his home, his family, his battles, and the tragic truth behind how it all ended. To understand who Thomas Mikl Ford really was, you have to look far beyond the punchlines. Long before audiences knew him as the smooth, unshakable Tommy Strawn, Ford was a kid growing up in a world where humor wasn't just fun, it was armor. Born on September 5, 1964, in Yonkers, New York, Ford was raised in a working-class family that valued discipline, resilience, and faith. He spent much of his youth in the Bronx during the 1970s and 1980s, a period marked by economic hardship, social tension, and limited opportunity. In that environment, survival required awareness and adaptability. Comedy became Ford's way of connecting, diffusing conflict, and standing out without drawing danger. Unlike many actors whose paths are shaped early by Hollywood ambition, Ford's journey was unusually grounded. He attended college, worked regular jobs, and lived what most would consider a normal life. Acting was not an obsession. It was a calling that arrived gradually. Friends and classmates often noticed his natural presence, his ability to command attention without trying. Ford himself remained modest, unsure whether that presence could ever translate into a career. That changed when he began pursuing acting seriously in the late 1980s. Small roles followed, including early film work that allowed him to study the craft rather than chase stardom. One of those early appearances came in Harlem Nights, where he absorbed the rhythms of professional sets and learned how seasoned performers carried themselves. These experiences shaped his approach, quiet, observant, and disciplined. Everything shifted in the early 1990s when casting began for Martin, the sitcom led by Martin Lawrence. Ford auditioned for the role of Tommy Strawn, one of Martin Payne's closest friends. On paper, the character was simple, a loyal sidekick meant to support the lead's explosive energy. What Ford brought to the role changed everything. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with a calm demeanor and effortless charm, Ford gave Tommy a grounded presence that balanced the show's chaos. While Martin Payne was loud, impulsive, and often reckless, Tommy was cool, confident, and controlled. That contrast created instant chemistry. Audiences didn't just laugh at Tommy, they trusted him. The character quickly became a fan favorite. But what truly cemented Tommy Strawn in television history was a running joke that started almost accidentally. Early in the show's development, Ford expressed concern to the writers that his character lacked depth. Tommy had no clear job, no visible ambitions, and little backstory. Rather than dismiss the concern, the writers transformed it into comedy. "You ain't got no job, Tommy." The line became iconic. The mystery surrounding Tommy's employment turned into one of the most quoted jokes of the decade. Ironically, even when the show later revealed that Tommy worked as a counselor at the Boys and Girls Club, fans preferred the mystery. What began as Ford advocating for better writing became one of the show's defining elements. Behind the scenes, Ford was known as the emotional anchor of the cast. While other personalities clashed or carried tension, he remained steady. Co-stars described him as positive, uplifting, and deeply spiritual. He avoided conflict, encouraged collaboration, and often acted as the glue holding the group together during long production days. When Martin premiered in 1992, it quickly became more than a hit. It became a cultural force. The show spoke directly to Black audiences, with humor rooted in lived experience, language, and social reality rarely seen in primetime television. It offered representation without apology, and comedy without dilution. Ford appeared in every single episode across all 5 seasons, a testament to how integral Tommy Strawn was to the show's identity. The ensemble dynamic worked because each character played a precise role, and Ford's role was balance. Without him, the chaos would have collapsed. But success carries its own complications. As Martin grew into a phenomenon, Ford became inseparable from Tommy Strawn in the public eye. Fans loved him, but they loved the character more. This admiration, while affirming, planted the seeds of a problem many sitcom actors face: typecasting. When the show ended in 1997, not because of declining ratings, but due to off-screen conflict, Ford found himself at a crossroads. The role that had defined him also confined him. Casting directors saw Tommy before they saw Thomas Mikl Ford. Determined to break free from that shadow, Ford pursued dramatic roles. His most significant post-Martin opportunity came with New York Undercover, where he portrayed Lieutenant Malcolm Barker. The role was deliberate and strategic. Barker was serious, authoritative, and emotionally restrained, the complete opposite of Tommy Strawn. Critics praised Ford's performance, noting his ability to command scenes with gravity and restraint. For a moment, it seemed he had successfully pivoted, but the industry's memory proved stubborn. Despite strong work, offers continued to lean toward comedy. Guest roles on shows like The Parkers and The Jamie Foxx Show leaned into his established persona rather than expanding it. The frustration was real, but Ford rarely voiced it publicly. Instead, he redirected his energy. Rather than allow disappointment to harden him, Ford turned toward service. Drawing from his own upbringing, he became deeply invested in community outreach. He focused on addressing issues he had witnessed firsthand: racism, violence, drug abuse, and the lack of positive mentorship for young people. He founded a nonprofit organization aimed at breaking down communication barriers and empowering youth. He became a motivational speaker, traveling to schools across the country. His message was consistent: responsibility, self-worth, and discipline matter. Ford also turned to writing. His I Am Beautiful book series was designed to build confidence in children, particularly those growing up in environments similar to his own. Titles like I Am Responsible for Me and Stop the Violence reflected his belief that early guidance could change lives. There was a quiet irony in this transformation. The man whose most famous character had no job found a purpose far more meaningful than steady acting work. While Hollywood struggled to redefine him, he redefined himself. This chapter of Ford's life brought fulfillment that fame alone never had. He spoke often about legacy, asking young audiences what kind of impact they wanted to leave behind. For Ford, legacy wasn't about applause, it was about influence. Yet, while his public work projected hope and stability, his private life told a more complicated story. Ford's marriage to Gina Sasso initially appeared to ground him. They married in 1997, at the height of Martin's success, with Martin Lawrence serving as a groomsman. Together, they had 2 children and presented the image of a stable, loving family. But by the 2000s, cracks had formed. The marriage ended in divorce in 2014, ushering in a period of upheaval. Ford moved frequently, leaving Los Angeles for Florida and later settling in Atlanta. He was searching for peace, for reinvention, for a fresh start. It was in Atlanta that he spent his later years with his girlfriend, Vivian Brazil. On the surface, life seemed to be stabilizing again. He was reconnecting with fans, developing new projects, and cautiously rebuilding. But unresolved personal conflicts, legal disputes, and emotional strain weighed heavily on him. These challenges, combined with career frustration and financial pressure, created a burden few outside his inner circle fully understood. Still, Ford continued forward. By 2016, at age 52, he appeared hopeful. He spoke about new creative ideas. He maintained his outreach work. And when chronic knee pain began limiting his mobility, he approached surgery with optimism. It was meant to be routine. It was meant to be the beginning of something better. No one, not his doctors, not his family, not Ford himself, could have imagined how quickly everything would change. By the mid-2000s, Mikl Ford was living a dual reality. Publicly, he remained a beloved television icon, instantly recognized, warmly received, and forever associated with laughter. Privately, his life was growing more complex, shaped by emotional strain, legal battles, and the quiet pressure of expectations that never fully loosened their grip. The contrast between image and reality weighed on him more than most people realized. After Martin ended, Ford worked steadily, but not at the level many assumed. Residual fame does not always translate into consistent opportunity, especially for sitcom actors whose characters become cultural shorthand. Audiences loved Tommy Strawn, but casting executives struggled to imagine Ford as anyone else. The admiration that followed him everywhere was sincere, yet limiting. Rather than retreat, Ford tried to adapt. He leaned further into community work, expanding his nonprofit initiatives and increasing his presence as a motivational speaker. Schools welcomed him not just because he was famous, but because he spoke with authenticity. He didn't lecture, he listened. He spoke openly about discipline, responsibility, and the long-term consequences of short-term choices. To many young people, he was more than an actor. He was proof that someone from their background could make it, and still come back to help. At the same time, Ford began exploring more creative control behind the camera. He directed and produced projects aligned with his values. Most notably the documentary Through My Lens, ATL, which addressed bullying and youth violence. The project reflected his growing desire to shape narratives, rather than simply perform in them. But personal stability proved harder to achieve. Ford's marriage to Gina Sasso, once a source of grounding, had been unraveling for years. The pressures of fame, finances, and constant travel strained the relationship. Their divorce in 2014 marked a painful turning point. It wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the loss of a familiar structure that had anchored him during his most successful years. Following the divorce, Ford moved frequently. He left Los Angeles, spent time in Florida, and eventually settled in Atlanta. Each move represented an attempt to reset, to escape the weight of expectations tied to a single role and a single city. Atlanta offered something different: a growing film industry, a strong Black creative community, and distance from the Hollywood machinery that had defined so much of his adult life. It was there that Ford entered a new relationship with Vivian Brazil. Friends described the period as cautiously hopeful. He was rebuilding, emotionally and professionally, while trying to maintain peace amid lingering disputes from his past. One of those disputes would come to dominate the final years of his life. In 2014, Ford became entangled in a bitter custody battle involving Vanessa Simmons, the mother of one of his children. What began as a legal disagreement quickly escalated into public accusations that shocked those who had long viewed Ford as a calm, principled advocate for children. Simmons filed a restraining order and alleged that Ford had been verbally and physically abusive. Among the most serious claims were accusations that he had beaten their young son with a belt and used degrading language that created an emotionally unsafe environment. The allegations spread rapidly. For Ford, the impact was devastating, not only legally, but reputationally. The man who had dedicated years to motivational speaking, authored children's books about responsibility, and stood in classrooms preaching nonviolence, now faced accusations that directly contradicted everything he publicly represented. Ford denied the claims. But in the court of public opinion, denial rarely restores balance once allegations take hold. Regardless of the outcome, the damage was done. Invitations slowed. Partnerships hesitated. The contradiction between his advocacy work and the accusations became an unspoken weight that followed him everywhere. Those close to Ford described the period as emotionally exhausting. Legal stress, financial pressure, and the sense of being misunderstood compounded his frustration. He rarely addressed the allegations publicly, choosing instead to focus on resolving matters privately and continuing his work. Still, the strain showed. Friends noticed that Ford, once unshakably positive, carried a heaviness he hadn't before. He remained kind, supportive, and generous, but there was a quiet sadness beneath the surface, the kind that comes from feeling judged not by actions, but by headlines. Despite everything, Ford did not abandon his mission. He continued writing, speaking, and mentoring. He spoke often about forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of not letting one chapter define an entire life. Yet, unresolved conflict has a way of lingering, even when unspoken. By 2016, Ford's health had also begun to challenge him. Years of physical work, travel, and stress had taken a toll. Chronic knee pain limited his mobility, making everyday movement increasingly difficult. For someone who valued independence and activity, the limitation was frustrating. After consulting with doctors, Ford decided to undergo knee replacement surgery, a common procedure, especially for individuals dealing with long-term joint damage. The goal was simple: reduce pain, restore mobility, and allow him to return fully to his work and active lifestyle. There was no sense of dread surrounding the decision, no warning signs, no urgency beyond quality of life. On September 28, 2016, Ford checked into a hospital in Atlanta, believing he was taking a step toward renewal. Before the procedure, he posted a message to fans on social media. It was brief, heartfelt, and characteristic of him. "I'm having a knee replacement surgery this morning. Please keep me in your prayers. Love you all." The surgery itself was uneventful. Doctors reported no complications. Ford emerged in good spirits, grateful and optimistic. Physical therapy began almost immediately, and he approached it with determination. In the days that followed, his recovery appeared textbook. Ford shared videos of himself stretching, walking, and completing therapy exercises. He thanked fans for their prayers and encouragement. Therapists noted that he was hitting milestones quickly. There were no signs of infection, no abnormal pain, no concerning symptoms. To everyone watching, doctors, loved ones, and fans, Ford seemed to be healing exactly as expected. By October 7th, he shared what would become his final update. The post showed him smiling, engaged in therapy, and speaking about getting back to work once his mobility improved. It felt hopeful, forward-looking, earned. No one suspected it was a farewell. Just 2 days later, without warning, Ford's health collapsed. On October 9, 2016, he was rushed to a hospital, not for complications related to his knee, but for something far more catastrophic. An abdominal aortic aneurysm had ruptured suddenly and violently. The event was immediate and life-threatening. One moment, Ford was recovering. The next, he was fighting for his life. Doctors worked urgently to stabilize him, but the damage was extensive. The rupture deprived his brain of oxygen, causing severe injury. Ford was placed on life support as medical teams assessed the situation. News spread quickly and chaotically. Early reports were confused, and misinformation circulated online. Actor Anthony Anderson mistakenly tweeted that Ford had died, only to delete the message when it became clear that he was still alive but critically injured. The confusion fueled speculation and fear among fans who had just seen him smiling days earlier. The timeline felt impossible. How could a man recovering so well from routine surgery suddenly be on life support? Medical experts were clear. The aneurysm was unrelated to the knee surgery. Orthopedic procedures and abdominal aneurysms are medically independent. Aneurysms can exist silently for years, rupturing without warning. But logic offered little comfort. For fans, the proximity of events felt too cruel to accept as coincidence. Questions emerged, not from evidence, but from grief. In moments of sudden loss, people search for meaning, patterns, or someone to blame. Ford's family remained private as doctors monitored his condition. Days passed with no improvement. The damage was too severe. On October 12, 2016, after 3 days on life support, Ford's loved ones faced the most painful decision imaginable. With no signs of meaningful recovery and his vital functions failing, they chose to withdraw life-sustaining treatment. Surrounded by family and friends, Mikl Ford passed away at age 52. The laughter stopped, abruptly, unfairly. The world mourned the loss of a familiar presence, but those closest to him mourned something deeper. The man who had been rebuilding, hoping, and believing that better days were ahead. And even in death, questions lingered. Not because answers were hidden, but because the randomness of tragedy is often the hardest truth to accept. The news of Thomas Mikl Ford's death spread with a kind of disbelief that only comes when loss feels out of sequence. He had been recovering. He had been smiling. He had been talking about the future. And then, suddenly, there was no future left to discuss. In the hours after his passing, tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment world. Fans who had grown up watching Martin flooded social media with clips, quotes, and memories. For many, Tommy Strawn wasn't just a character, he was comfort. A familiar presence who felt like part of the family. But for those who knew Ford personally, the grief was sharper and more intimate. Martin Lawrence, his longtime friend and co-star, was devastated. The two men had shared 5 intense years on one of television's most influential sitcoms, navigating success, pressure, and cultural impact together. Lawrence later admitted that losing Ford was a blow that shook him deeply, not just professionally, but personally. Ford had been more than a castmate. He had been a stabilizing force during chaotic moments, a voice of reason, and a source of quiet loyalty. Other cast members echoed that sentiment. Tisha Campbell shared an emotional tribute, urging fans to send love and prayers to Ford's family. Her message carried added weight given the complicated history surrounding the show's ending. Martin did not conclude because audiences drifted away. It ended amid serious off-screen conflict that fractured relationships and reshaped the final season. For years, fans hoped for a full reunion of the core cast: Martin, Gina, Pam, Cole, and Tommy, even if only for an interview or special. That hope quietly died with Ford. His passing marked the first permanent loss from the show's central circle, turning nostalgia into mourning. In interviews and statements, those who worked closely with Ford consistently returned to the same words: calm, kind, spiritual, dependable. He was described as the glue, the one who kept spirits up, tensions down, and egos in check. On a set known for big personalities, Ford's steadiness mattered. As tributes continued, attention inevitably returned to the circumstances of his death. The timeline still troubled people. From September 28th to October 12th, just 2 weeks. From routine surgery to irreversible loss. Even as doctors explained the medical reality, emotional logic struggled to accept it. Medical experts remained firm. An abdominal aortic aneurysm can exist silently for years. It can rupture without warning. And it is medically unrelated to knee replacement surgery. There was no evidence of negligence, no indication of surgical error, no signs that anyone missed something obvious. Still, the questions persisted. Not because evidence suggested wrongdoing, but because sudden loss leaves the mind grasping for structure. When someone dies unexpectedly, randomness feels cruel, and cruelty demands explanation. For fans who had watched Ford's hopeful recovery updates, the shock felt personal. The brain looks for patterns when the heart refuses to accept chance. Ford's family chose privacy, declining to fuel speculation or debate. That decision, while understandable, left space for rumor to grow. Online forums filled with theories, many contradicting medical fact. But over time, most settled back into the truth supported by physicians. A tragic coincidence, devastating in timing, but not mysterious in cause. As the noise faded, a more meaningful question emerged. What should Ford be remembered for? It would be easy to freeze him in time as Tommy Strawn, the smooth, cool best friend with the iconic line about not having a job. And that role will always matter. Martin remains one of the most important sitcoms in American television history, particularly for its influence on Black representation and comedy. Ford's contribution to that legacy is permanent, but reducing his life to a single character misses the larger picture. Off-screen, Ford dedicated years to community work that rarely received the same attention as his acting. He spoke in schools, mentored young people, and wrote books aimed at building confidence and responsibility in children. His I Am series wasn't a vanity project, it was a mission. He believed deeply that guidance at a young age could change trajectories. Those who attended his talks remember his sincerity. He didn't glamorize success. He spoke about discipline, consequences, and self-respect. He reminded students that choices matter, not just in careers, but in character. In many ways, the man who played a character teased for having no job devoted himself to some of the most demanding work there is, trying to steer young lives away from harm. Ford also sought to grow creatively behind the camera. His documentary work, including projects focused on bullying and youth violence, reflected a desire to address real issues rather than simply entertain. This phase of his career may not have brought fame, but it brought meaning. That contrast, between public laughter and private purpose, defined much of Ford's life. He understood the limits of celebrity. He knew that fame fades, roles end, and applause quiets. What mattered to him, especially later in life, was impact. The ability to leave something behind that extended beyond television reruns. Even his struggles form part of that story. Ford's later years were not easy. Legal disputes, public allegations, financial stress, and health challenges created a burden that weighed heavily on him. The contrast between how he was seen and what he was experiencing internally created a loneliness few people recognized. And yet, those close to him say he rarely lost his gentleness. He continued to encourage others. He continued to believe in second chances. He continued to hope for a future that, tragically, he never reached. In the weeks following his death, fans revisited their favorite episodes of Martin. Scenes that once brought uncomplicated laughter now carried a softer tone. Moments felt heavier, not because they were sad, but because they were finite. One scene, in particular, resurfaced repeatedly: the DMV episode. Tommy and Martin standing side by side, arguing with Miss Jerry, only to be humiliated together. For longtime fans, it had always been sacred. Now it felt symbolic. 3 performers from that scene, Tommy Ford, Sherman Hemsley, and actress Jerry Gray, were gone. What remained was memory. That is how legacy works. It outlives conflict. It outlives rumor. It outlives even tragedy. What remains of Thomas Mikl Ford is not the unanswered "what if" surrounding his death, but the countless thank yous left behind by those he entertained, inspired, and supported. His life reminds us of something uncomfortable but true. Endings are often unfair. Growth does not guarantee time. Healing does not promise safety. And sometimes, the most meaningful chapters are the ones cut short. But within that truth is something else. A responsibility to remember fully. Not just the jokes, not just the character, but the man who carried both with grace. In the end, what remains of Thomas Mikl Ford is not the shock of how quickly his life ended, but the quiet weight of how fully he lived it. The suddenness of his passing may have frozen time for fans, but his legacy continues to move, carried forward through memory, laughter, and the lives he touched beyond the screen. For many, Ford will always be Tommy Strawn, the calm in the storm, the loyal friend who stood steady while chaos swirled around him. On Martin, Tommy wasn't just comic relief, he was balance. He grounded the madness, softened the edges, and made the show's world feel real. Without him, the chemistry wouldn't have worked. And that's why his absence still feels so noticeable years later. But Tommy Strawn was only one chapter. Away from the spotlight, Ford worked deliberately to redefine success on his own terms. When Hollywood struggled to see him beyond a single role, he refused to let that limitation define his worth. He invested his time where it mattered most to him, in classrooms, community centers, and conversations with young people who needed guidance more than applause. His books, his speeches, and his nonprofit work weren't side projects. They were purpose. He believed that representation meant responsibility, and that being visible carried an obligation to give back. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, Ford was still showing up, listening, encouraging, and reminding others that their choices mattered. That commitment makes the contradictions of his later years harder to hold. Like many people, Ford's life was not a straight line. It included success and struggle, hope and disappointment, public admiration and private pain. Legal conflicts, relationship turmoil, and health challenges weighed on him during his final decade. Those chapters complicate his story, but they also humanize it. Lives are rarely clean. Legacies are rarely simple.